On Thursday, December 30th, 2021, the communities in and around Boulder County, Colorado experienced what is to date the most destructive fire in the state's history. While the area was accustomed to dry conditions, high winds, and even wildfires, the unpredictability and devastation of the Marshall Fire was unprecedented. This fire, which started as a wildfire but rapidly evolved into an urban conflagration, was fueled by extremely dry vegetation and wind gusts that reached 115 miles per hour. It burned everything in its path as it jumped over a 6-lane highway with ease. Entire subdivisions were decimated despite the heroic efforts of hundreds, if not thousands, of emergency personnel. Approximately 35,000 individuals were evacuated from their homes with little to no time to grab personal belongings. The fire also threatened a number of residential care facilities and hospitals, forcing them to evacuate vulnerable and critically sick patients into a healthcare system that was already incredibly stressed due to the COVID-19 Omicron surge and staffing shortages. The following day, New Year's Eve, as snow fell from the sky, the community was able to take in the full impact of the Marshall Fire. Just over 6,000 acres had burned, with 1,084 homes destroyed and 159 structures damaged. While the damage assessment and recovery process is ongoing, it is estimated that the fire caused more than $2 billion in losses. Remarkably, there were no serious injuries to first responders. However, tragically, 2 members of the community did lose their lives. The communities that were impacted by this historic event continue to recover and rebuild their lives. And while those first responders and healthcare workers who worked tirelessly to protect their communities are working to heal and recover, they also recognize the importance of sharing their stories and learning from this incident so that they and others can be better prepared to respond and save lives. This 4-part Marshall Fire Learning Series brings the stories from Fire and EMS responders, the hospital evacuation team, residential communities evacuations, and the efforts provided for regional coordination.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. We're here to present the Marshall Fire Learning Series from the firefighting perspective. We'll go down the line and let everybody introduce themselves.
Hello everyone, my name is Paul Johnson. Most people call me PJ, and I am the Division Chief of EMS for Mountain View Fire. On the day of, my role was initially sort of staging and resource management, and then that progressed into being a division supervisor, so I ended up being in charge of what we originally called the South Division, and then later became Division Zulu once we had a little more command and infrastructure set up. And my area of response was kind of the southern edge of the fire as it came in through Superior and the Rock Creek neighborhood, and Vista Hospitals and Good Samaritan Hospitals as well.
And I'm Commander Randy Wilbur with the Boulder County Sheriff's Office, and my role that day was to help coordinate the evacuations and road closures during the fire, so the firefighters could fight fires and we could get civilians out of the area safely.
I'm Captain Roy Leggett. I responded from home on the day of the Marshall Fire. I knew that a significant incident was happening, responded to my home station, and as I left the station, rounded the corner to respond to what I thought was going to be the command post, and discovered the fire immediately behind the station a couple blocks, and ended up being one of the first fire apparatus units in the Spanish Hills neighborhood.
My name's Aaron Peavy. I'm the Division Chief of Training for Mountain View Fire. Not on duty that day, but at work. Initially tied in with PG on the South Division, and ultimately ended up working with Chief Fulden in Zulu, the Discovery Park neighborhood.
I'm Sterling Fulden. I'm the Deputy Chief of Operations for Mountain View Fire. I was one of the initial responding chiefs, and then took over Division Alpha, or Original Town Superior, and worked for the rest of the duration of the fire there.
So we're here to kind of relay our experiences and some of the lessons learned that, from the Marshall Fire. I'll start. Again, my name is PJ, I'm Division Chief of EMS, and that day I was in the Southern Division. So I actually wasn't on duty, but I was at work, just in the office, and was kind of paying attention to the radio just because we knew we were going to get big winds, and had heard there was a fire up to the north side of Boulder that had started, and a lot of resources were being sent there. And then I heard the Marshall Fire kick off, and you kind of get the sort of the tingling in your arms feeling of like, wow, that might not be good. And the more I listened to it, the more I realized it was probably going to be bad, or at least a significant incident. So I just started driving that way. I didn't really have, wasn't dispatched as part of the dispatch. And my initial thought was to try to tie in with the incident commander and just see if I could help them out. And as I came around the corner on 95th and Dillon, you could see the huge header of smoke, and with the radio traffic and everything, knew it was going to be a problem. And I just asked if, where they needed me, and originally I was sent to staging on the south side. So my original role was to I should back up. The first thing I did was drive behind Costco to the Sagamore neighborhood. And I arrived there in the smoke, and you could hear the fire and you could feel the fire, but there was, you couldn't see any fire. And I tied in with a police officer who was guarding the front of the neighborhood and helping with evacuations. And it was clear that he was struggling with all the smoke and debris and everything like that. And he immediately asked me if I had any goggles, which I did not. And then he relayed that all the fire resources were evacuating the area. So I told him he should probably go too. And the conditions were so bad that I felt like I was in a pretty bad spot and really needed to get out of there. So as I tried to leave, I could not see the hood of my car. And just because I know the area, I was able to slowly just kind of inch my way out of there. And my next thought was to get up high where I could try to see the fire as it was moving into the original town area. So I went up to, there's a trailhead kind of up by the Key Bank. And I was able to look down into the fire, and all I could see was smoke. Never could see any flames or anything like that. Still couldn't figure out where the fire was. But based on the radio traffic, you could tell that there was a significant number of homes that were on fire. And so I just, started confirming evacuations, started, making sure that things were actually evacuated, and then just trying to put myself into a position. And eventually I realized, hey, we were probably going to need more resources. I called Incident Command, asked if they had started ordering outside of the county to the agencies to the south, and he said they had not. And I asked if I could. He said, absolutely. So I just started ordering resources via our main dispatch channel and asked if they could give us North Metro, Westminster, Thornton, Arvada. I think those were the only ones I name requested, and just asked them to send whatever they had available. And then, of course, once you order resources, then you kind of have to have a place to send them. So my initial job was to essentially act as a staging officer. So I set up a staging area at the top of McCaslin and just kind of sat up there. And as the resources came in, I was sending them down into the original town area where they were needed to Chief Folden, who was managing the original town area. And that's kind of how I started. Shortly thereafter, we got word that the Avista Hospital was needing to evacuate. And I believe we'll cover that in a different area of the learning series. But I went over to Avista and managed the evacuation of Avista. And then at that point, got word that the fire was impinging on a neighborhood called the Ridge. And at some point in there, I'd realized that this whole south side of the fire needed more management. And I asked Incident Command if we could just set up a south side of the fire under the Incident Command. So I became the South Division, which later got renamed to Division Zulu. And so I was the Division Supervisor of Division Zulu. I made my way back over to the Ridge neighborhood and found it almost on fire. There was fire coming up the south side, and as I got up into the neighborhood, I knew I had resources not very far away, and that they would be there close. And I'd brought a captain that worked for me, Captain Siebert, with me. And as I made it into that neighborhood, I ran around the side of the first set of apartment buildings and found the fire coming up through the junipers, and there was a garden hose there. So I just grabbed the garden hose, turned it on, started spraying off the bushes to keep the fire from getting into the building. And I heard the building behind me sort of go up and explode. fire going up the outside, and right then the fire resources arrived. So my priorities were management of the incident, right? And the only thing I could think of was that I needed to keep diversifying because I had a lot of resources, or at least what was available, and that I knew I couldn't manage all of them by myself. And the one thing they teach you in incident command is that your span of control is 5 to 7 roughly. So I was finding people to put into what we would call groups or divisions under my division. I named them command that day, so that was definitely a lesson learned for me. I used the wrong incident command terminology. So I called them Ridge Command, and I put a captain in charge because I knew that this was going to be an all-night affair to defend this neighborhood. And so once we got the initial attack started on that neighborhood, I put Captain Ed Siebert in charge. And left because I knew that we needed to finish up the evacuation of the hospital, and then I was starting to get word that other areas of that South Division were going to be a problem. And then that was right when the fire started to cross into the Rock Creek neighborhood, and so we made a significant stand on the kind of the west side. I only had one Arvada Type 6 available. And I just had them pump and roll and put out all the fences on the west side of the Rock Creek neighborhood. And luckily they were able to keep it from getting in on kind of that high side. But the biggest problem for us was resource management. I mean, there just wasn't enough resources for what we needed them to do. So I just went around to the south side then after finishing up the Avista evacuation. I also had that neighborhood to the north, the St. Andrews neighborhood, which I had turned over to Chief Mark Doherty, who was also managing the Avista evacuation. And when I got back over to Avista, I realized that that neighborhood was quite a huge problem and needed more management. It was too much to manage the Avista evacuation in the St. Andrews neighborhood, so I found an Arvada battalion chief, Chief Hyatt, and I asked him if he would take over management of the Avista neighborhood. So I put him in charge of that. He became the St. Andrews Command, and they were ordering resources off of North Metro's fire channel. So that for me would be like a huge lesson learned, would be ordering from an unaffected dispatch center. We were able to get massive amounts of resources that we probably wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Well, trying to order resources from a single dispatch center that is also responsible for answering all of the 911 phone calls and managing the fire incident, it just becomes too overwhelming. And so, one of the lessons we learned that day was if you really need other resources, you need to order through an unaffected dispatch center. So, for us in the Avista evacuation, that meant ordering through North Metro's dispatch center. Using resources that you wouldn't normally use, like ordering resources, ambulance resources through the Healthcare Coalition and emergency management, instead of through the incident. And it became a huge win for us in just we were able to get resources. Having Chief Doherty at Avista, he was able to, get a structure response initially to help defend the hospital, and then he just started, ordering resources for the neighborhood to the north. And by the time I got back to him, I realized that it was more than he could manage or should manage, and so I installed another level of incident command, which would for sure be a lesson learned, was the need to keep diversifying your command, and putting in place different levels, different groups to manage the big portions of the incident. So, resource management was a huge piece of it, and the big problem was we weren't able to get all the resources that we needed, but the resources we did get, we had to manage, and so, one of my initial jobs was staging, and so I was sending resources down to Sterling, down in original town area. So, if you want to talk about Sterling, what you were doing with the resources, and if you were short on needs or what you needed, and how you managed them.
Yeah, absolutely. So December 30th, 2021, so it's December, it's winter time. Turns out that this is one of the driest 6 months that's been on record. It's one of the warmest 6 months that was been on record. The temps were in the 40s, and we knew it was going to be one of the windiest days that it had occurred in those 6 months. So in my head, we start talking about the Swiss cheese effect, and you can apply that to all sorts of things. You apply it in healthcare and things like that. But as soon as all those holes line up, you have a catastrophe that rolls through this thing, right? So the Swiss cheese model was starting to line up those days. And we're aware of it, right? High wind warnings, things like that. So we're prepped for those. I also was at home on vacation that day, but we're listening to the radio, we're paying attention, because as the Swiss cheese starts to line up, more and more people start to get that feeling, that gut feeling that if something happens, what's going to happen, and it could go wrong. So we had
one of the elements was a week earlier we had had a significant wind event, and this one was not predicted to be as bad.
Right.
And I think there was a certain degree of not complacency, but we definitely didn't anticipate the significance of the wind event.
The winds were clocked at 115 miles an hour at one point, sustained at 80-ish. So high winds. I've grown up in Boulder. We're used to high winds, but this was a unique event. And we talked about complacency or alarm fatigue. So you get all these red flags throughout the year, and you get all these situations, high fire danger, weather watches, these things. And a lot of people, especially citizens, start to become complacent. They get that alarm fatigue. I've heard about this red flag before, it was fine. We've had high winds before, it's been fine. So that all adds to that Swiss cheese model about these things are just starting to adjust just right, that we're starting to see the holes line up through there. The Swiss cheese model is essentially that if you have an action and at the end of the action there's going to be a consequence. And the Swiss cheese layer is if you take the Swiss cheese and put it into slices, and if you don't manage the slices correctly, the holes will begin to line up, and allowing that action to go through every hole in the Swiss cheese and creates a consequence. Most likely it's a consequence that has, a poor outcome, a catastrophic outcome to it. It can. Those layers of cheese, right? Some is weather, some is staffing, some is wind, some is fuel conditions, communications, busyness of the day. All those things are, you could have 1,000 pieces of cheese if you wanted to dive into it that much.
It's a big piece of cheese.
It's a log of cheese. It's a true log of cheese. Yep. So as the day progressed, there was a smaller fire in North Boulder that units happened to get to as in a neighborhood and get that extinguished. After that, another fire started up near Left Hand Canyon. Units were responding to that. That was starting to grow in size. That day, part of the Swiss cheese is I had an acting battalion chief in place. So an acting battalion chief for us is someone who doesn't sit in that seat regularly every day. That's not their normally assigned position, but someone's on vacation, so someone steps up and fills the role. Acting battalion chief, we had communicated, started talking about a plan because that fire that was up by Left Hand Canyon was also going to start to impact the Mountain View district. Decided it was probably best to head in that day and check out what was going on to try to kind of start to build situational awareness with me and the acting BC and just see what was kind of going on out in the area. As I left my neighborhood, I live locally. I heard the engines calling for assistance down in the Marshall area, and so I diverted from going up to the office into the Marshall area. As PJ's described, can't see past the hood. We're getting calls that a structure was on fire, so we start to increase the level of response. So we went from a smoke report to a grass fire to a structure fire, and we're starting to progress through that. Part of the problem that day was because of the wind, a lot of other resources around us were busy dealing with wind events as well. Down power lines, trampolines flying around, right? Like you start to get these kind of calls, and so that starts to get your resources and neighboring apparatus busy. Dispatch starts to become inundated with phone calls, not because of the fire yet, but because of the wind event. Things are breaking, reports are going on, there's traffic lights out, right? There's traffic lights out, cars turned over, my neighbor's trampolines in my yard, what are we gonna do? So resources starting to get stretched thin already. And here we are starting to try to wrap this response up. So as we get closer to the fire, visibility's not past the hood. If you're in the smoke, the dust, those kinds of things, you can't see past the hood. You got to try to find some situational awareness, get to a high point, get to a other side that isn't affected by all that. Very difficult to do. Communications were very difficult. Just initially because if you tried to talk to someone face to face, you couldn't. Yeah, I mean, unless you were standing so close to each other, right? And you were yelling at each other, you couldn't really communicate as well. So all these things are starting to pile up, and it's starting to add stress, and we're starting to get used to this. I
think geography is an underappreciated variable in all of this. We talk about the wind event and the resources, but geography really ended up splitting and dividing resources and really affecting access egress. And tying in with PJ as he was in the south end, I more or less became his forward scout bouncing between Rock Creek and Superior because of the geographic divide that the hill presented there. But that's also what created wedges in the fire and creating multiple incidents within the incident, including that ridge off of Marshall and Cherryville Road. That really drove two significant fire events, one that impacted Louisville and one that impacted Superior. And it was that geographic feature that more or less created two major incidents
I would even add to
concurrently
that
occurring.
South Boulder County, because when I rolled into Spanish Hills, I felt very alone.
Yeah.
And I couldn't reach command. I couldn't reach anybody. And we got in there, and it was a sheriff's officer, and I went in, and there were people everywhere.
Right, and it was face-to-face comms and door-to-door.
It was face-to-face, and I had hoped I was rolling into an incident that had a staging area, and I was going to report to some degree of leadership, and to turn and leave the station and have the fire not established in the neighborhood yet, but then to roll into the neighborhood and know that we have to just get to work. I did at one point kind of wondered if you guys even knew that Spanish Hills was on fire and that we were there. And did you guys know that people were in Spanish Hills?
So from that initial onset, the fire hadn't split that far yet, but it became quickly we became aware that this was going to be a life safety event, and that we weren't necessarily going to extinguish the fire like we'd typically gone into this thing, and it's a structure on fire, we'll extinguish this. Well, that turned around to not being the case. And making the mind switch from initial response and like, oh, this is a structure fire, we'll bring in resources, we'll get this thing put out, to this is much more. This is it extraordinary or extraordinary?
Either one.
I like extraordinary.
Yeah.
So this is an extraordinary event. And we have to really make a change and kind of write a couple things off, which is difficult to do, and flip your mindset into this is a life safety thing. We need to get out ahead of this and get out and start doing evacuations, right? And I think that's where a lot of great stories come out of is evacuations from the sheriff's department.
Yeah, so for me, I was on duty, so similar to what you guys said. I saw all the warning signs kind of lining up, the stars and everything lining up. But I'm thinking it's December, we would have to have something really kind of cook off for this thing to go, but it has the potential. And then right about that time was when the Middle Fork fire started up near Left Hand Canyon. And so I responded up there to that fire to help with that fire. And that one had the potential of running as far as the Marshall fire did. There's some factors there that made it didn't, but, and we were pulling resources up to there. And about that time was when I was realizing, hey, we're pulling in a lot of resources for this fire. I hope we don't get another one. And then just about that time, out of the corner of my eye, because the same thing, the wind, the debris, you couldn't talk. It was tearing doors out of people's hands, tearing doors off cars, smashing out windows. The wind event was just something we can sit here and talk about, but it's hard for someone to grasp what we're talking about. Like, you could not talk. A conversation between us two would not have happened outside in that wind. It just was not going to happen. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw the smoke coming up down from Superior. And it got so big so fast that I realized I'm at the wrong fire. And one of my roles as a commander with the sheriff's office is to go help manage the law enforcement, the evacuations, and the road closures. So there's two roles that we run. We try to go out and do door-to-door evacuations, and there's a couple reasons for that. One is up in the mountains, especially where we're used to this, cell phones sometimes are spotty, some people don't have landlines. And so even if we were to send out some sort of electronic alert and warning out to them, they may not get it. So we try to send deputies into the neighborhoods to do door-to-doors. We do that down in the more populated areas as well. But it also starts to give us an idea of who has animals that they're going to try to be evacuating and who's got mobility problems or issues or health concerns that we have to worry about that we're going to have to factor in on helping get these evacuations done. So I had to fight all the way down through Boulder to get down to the fire down in Marshall, the Marshall fire. And coming in through Boulder, traffic was bad. Traffic was backed up all the way through Boulder. We had blown over semi-trucks on 36. And the first time I tried to get down there, I tried to come down 36 because that's the fastest way. And that's when I realized this was something that I hadn't experienced in my 20-some years in law enforcement. That fire had already jumped across all lanes of 36. And we had fire on the south side of 36, fire on the north side of 36.
So US 36 is a highway that travels from Boulder to Denver. And there's a breakdown shoulder that's a full lane width. There's 2 lanes of normal traffic, and there's another lane of toll road, and then there's another like shoulder inside. So this is a massive concrete highway.
Yeah.
Typically something that you would think is, that's a fire break.
Right.
Like it's gonna roll up to that and it won't go across. It went across it with ease.
Walked across it.
And it wasn't necessarily Embercast that was going across, like flame links were licking across the entire highway.
Amazing.
So something we haven't experienced, yeah, because normally the roadways are pretty good fire breaks.
And that speaks to like kind of the recalibration of operational expectation. It took me a while to realize that this wasn't going to stop until the wind stopped. Yeah. That same seeing that plume, I began to think, all right, well, we'll keep it to the grasses,
Right.
until it wasn't kept to the grasses.
Yep.
Yeah, and it just.
And the speed that it got to Superior was what was shocking to me.
Yeah.
Leaving Longmont, it's 30-minute drive, and in those 30 minutes, what had gone on in those 30 minutes, and then coming into Superior was, it was just eye-opening, really.
Yeah.
One of my
shocking.
One of my favorite quotes was one of the deputies was quoted as saying, "I was driving 45 miles an hour and the fire passed me."
Yeah. It was by far the fastest moving fire I've experienced in my career.
Yeah.
I flanked south along 128 from Station 9 into Superior. We're good high point, and you could see it progress unlike I'd ever seen a grass fire progress. Yeah.
The other weird thing was not being able to see the fire, right? Like getting into Superior and not being actually able to see flames. I could hear flames, I could feel the heat, and it was just
That
all
is
I
not a
could see was-
tactic we normally employ
Right,
in
yeah.
getting out ahead of it, but that's where the people were.
Right.
And but because of that geographic split, you didn't know if you were because of the smoke and the wind and the debris. And when I tied in with you, PJ, at the top of McCaslin, it really was real-time probing neighborhoods just to see where it might be going.
Right.
But we don't normally scout in front of the fire front.
Yeah, we don't normally scout whole neighborhoods either. Like when you start thinking about I need to think about this as a neighborhood, like a whole neighborhood, and the fact that you might end up, losing a good chunk of that whole neighborhood. That's like you're making that mind shift in your head of like, okay, like this is truly something different.
Well, and I had some pretty good situational awareness coming into it because I responded from home and I was listening to the radio on a phone app, and I heard Chief Folden evacuating people. I heard Chief Melvin declare nobody getting head out of the fire, and I knew all that was happening in Superior. And so when I left Station 2, my initial intent was to drive down to Marshall, Superior area.
And that's on the north end. That was on the north end of everything.
Yeah, and we were north of everything, and we turned to go that direction, and I assumed once we saw it approaching Spanish Hills that we were on the flank. And I don't know if a wind shift happened or what, but we got into the neighborhood thinking we were going to be heroes and stop it from getting established in the homes there. And in the 30 seconds it took us to get out of the truck to size up the home and turn the truck around, flames were coming over the top of the house, and it was the 3 of us running for our lives to get out of this cul-de-sac.
Yeah, and for me, from my perspective on what you guys are talking about, as the person who's kind of running the law enforcement side of that, we're trying to plan. Okay, here's where we're at. Here's where the fire's at. Here's where it's going to go. Here's what I need to start thinking about evacuating, and without any of that situational awareness, because you didn't know where the fire was at and it was moving so fast, it was hard to get a grasp of that. And so there were times where we were sending deputies like in the Spanish Hills to do those evacuations, knowing it could go that direction. And before they could get back out of those subdivisions, they're locked into those subdivisions because the fire's burning over the roads to those areas. So that situational awareness was just horrible for us. And it took a long time to get that established and back up and running. And that usually, as the instant commander or someone running those groups or divisions, you have that. But what we were relying on were people to get that information back to us, and they were too busy doing work to get that information back to us. So it took us a while to get that situational awareness under control.
And I know we're talking about like we couldn't see the fire, and people are like, what do you mean you can't? It's one of the biggest fires like in the Front Range. You can't see the fire. So at one point, I was driving into Superior and I parked, and there's a Costco, and we all know how big Costco is. And I thought I was parked at an entrance to Costco sitting there. Well, it turns out I wasn't, because there was a quick brief gap in the smoke and debris. I was parked way further ahead along the street by their parking lot. So I couldn't even see 100 feet to see a Costco to make sure I was in the right intersection. So I had to kind of start relying on my navigation in my car to make sure I was in the right streets at the right, where I thought I was. I actually was verifying I was by the map in my car at that point instead.
Oh yeah, there was times when I was trying to get down to start managing the fire down there that I was driving what I call by braille, right? You were just going slow enough, hoping you didn't hit anything, because you could not see the front of your car. You could not see the bumper, and you definitely couldn't see any debris or stuff in the roadway. So you were just driving slow to get there.
Was that before or after the window got blown out of your car?
It was after.
That didn't help either.
That didn't help either, yeah.
That doesn't help.
Yeah.
I think, one of the things that you later realize is that, with 115 mile an hour clocked winds is that, the flames aren't standing straight up, right? I mean, they're laid down really flat and they're moving really far, really fast. And so you really couldn't see fire, which was super weird. Yeah. And the other thing that I figured out later was, after thinking about it for a while, was that the fire was moving, it would move in fingers as the wind would blow it. So it would move in a finger, but it was going through so fast and it was burning things, or not burning things. It was leaving an incomplete burn. And then later on, the fire would come through that same area again, and it was just really hard to figure out, where you should focus your attention and where the quote unquote the head of the fire was. Because it would burn through and then it would burn through again, and so you kept having to, at least I did. I was driving around a lot, just trying to figure out, where to put resources and where to focus my time and energy.
Yeah, and for me, same perspective is, normally when we've had fires elsewhere in the county, it's a running fire. However you guys describe it, I'm not a fire guy, but however you guys describe it, but you can see it progressing, you can see it burning in a certain direction, a certain speed. And this one just seemed like you'd have fire here, and then 100, 200 yards, eighth of a mile down the road, you'd have another fire, right? And then a fire over here. So it was hard to really grasp the footprint of this fire and where it was going.
Well, you'd see that too with the homes, where you'd be what you thought was the edge of the fire, and investing your time and energy, and then you'd turn around and a home behind you, two houses unburned, and then another just home on fire.
Yep.
And there's nothing burned in between them.
Yeah, that ember cast, chasing that ember cast was what we struggled with most through the night because of the construction style of the townhomes that we were working with. That ember cast would leapfrog over houses, and so everything would look cool where you were standing until you moved and you realized it was not.
Yeah, and one of the things we typically use on the wildland fire side of things is, the flyovers to get a overview of that, or sometimes the drones. But the weather was so bad you could not get anything in the air to get that situational awareness.
So, and we've talked a lot about ember cast, and for people that don't know what ember cast is, it's fire embers that get blown by the fire out. Unusual about this fire, though, as was everything else, was I was seeing softball-sized things on fire. We had whole 2x4s flying through the air on fire. You'd see full sheets of plywood flying through the air. So difficult. It's not your kind of like campfire embers that are blowing. It's chunks of stuff that are flying through the air, catching other things on fire. So in the townhomes, right, like one of the big issues, one of the insights is this ember cast, or these chunks of things that are flying over and catching things on fire, would land on a patio that has a very nice set, right? Like there's cushions and there's a couch and there's cushions. Well, that stuff just goes up so quick. And
we would counsel anybody who lived in the mountains, don't put that on your porch, but we're not counseling our suburban neighborhoods to not have nice patio furniture.
On the top of a 4-story townhome, right? Yeah. Like that doesn't make any sense for us to tell you don't put that patio furniture
mulch,
up there.
The furry mulch, that was perfect fodder for any.
So to combat that, we started going into people's homes, pulling in their patio furniture, and then putting it inside to try to keep things that could catch fire from catching fire from all this debris flying around that was on fire.
Yeah, I think some of the big insights for me was, early on we ended up having to evacuate a Vista, which we'll talk about in a different video series. But, it was a large, brick hospital that was, I thought, easily defendable from fire. In fact, when they called me and said, "Hey, we need to evacuate a Vista," I was like, "Ah, no, we don't. We can hold that, no problem." But the thing that I, later came to realize and change my mindset was, the size of the debris that was blowing through the air. I mean, it just takes one broken window. And, we ended up having several structures that we think, were lost to debris that came, through windows and stuff. And the other thing was the impact of the smoke, right? The main reason Vista ended up getting evacuated was the smoke and the ash and the dirt and everything was impacting their ventilation system so badly that, it was literally filling the hospital with soot and ash, and it was no longer a tenable place to be. And that happened in other buildings as well. So one of my big insights was evacuations, and then the size of the debris that was flying around that was on fire was. You sort of had to change your mindset about some of those bigger structures of like, oh yeah, we can defend that. It's a grass fire too. Yeah, no, we should probably consider evacuating that or
The Elements
or
Hotel.
full on. Yeah, or the Element Hotel.
I remember the kind of just shock and awe that went through the people I was near when we heard over the radio that the Elements Hotel was on fire. And it just changed.
Yeah, and
It was a bigger shift for me.
The Element was in my area.
Yeah.
And so I was in original town Superior, the Costco's, the Targets, those things, but also we had, blocks of older homes and then an Element Hotel and a Tesla dealership. So to defend that area, I had the amount of engines I would normally put on one structure being on fire. I defended, 30 blocks or something like that with that same amount of equipment. So you have to make that, again, another mind shift is like, okay, what's critical infrastructure? What do I have to protect to keep a town operating, an economy operating, some of those things, and what can we let go because we just don't have the resource to cover it? Tesla was a big factor because it got a lot of lithium batteries were there. There were a ton of cars parked in there, and that creates a big hazmat issue. We're near a creek that causes another issue. Element Hotel was fully sprinklered. We checked the doors, they were locked. But when you pulled up onto it, a majority of the windows on that one side were broken and gone. And the curtains were blowing in the wind, and debris would just go into the rooms. And water streams were ineffective out from the outside of the water, and resource and person power was non-existent to go inside and do anything. So you kind of had to make some tough decisions on what are we going to do to protect the town and, like I said, the economy and to get things rebuilt quicker. And that's tough to do when you're in the heat of the battle and you've come in and you're thinking, grass fire, structure fire, town's on fire. Now I have to pick and choose about months ahead about how can I get the recovery to go faster. It's not typical. And so if people haven't thought about it and trained to it and done those things, it's not bad to run a few scenarios through your head and think about if I'm faced with a situation like this, what do I do?
Well, I was super impressed that you had the foresight to think about that, because I was not thinking that far ahead, but you came up with the idea of hey, we need to protect the town hall because that's where the records are, right? And that was one of the
that was an
things,
assumption, right? That's where they have all their meetings, that's where they approve plans, that's where they keep records. Either, I don't know if there's local servers in there or not, but that's kind of the hub of the community to keep them running, so we should protect it.
Yeah, we should try
to
put resources there.
When you were finally able to send me resources at a new start later into the event, my initial briefing was, we're going to lose some of this. Our goal is to keep it to this, and that's the first time I've gotten first resource in on something, and that's my initial action plan, and is the acceptable losses, and what are we going to try to keep this to, and what do we know that we're just not going to be able to save. Very atypical. First time I've ever had to make my initial briefing we're going to lose a house.
Yeah.
Yep.
And we're just not used to it in this part of the country, right? I think the same process happens in hurricanes and a lot of those things about what infrastructure has to be hardened and protected. And we live in the bubble here kind of thing, right? We get some winds, we get some blizzards, but we've never, at least in my lifetime and in my career, I've never had to deal with any of that. So.
Well, and along those lines, so the warning and the evacuation side was on our side. That fire was moving faster than we could get the warnings out, right? And unlike a hurricane or something like that, where people have 2-3 days to plan, we had to see the fire, understand it was a big issue, and then start doing the evacuation. So that was an insight on my part. Is these evacuations, they have to happen fast, and sometimes we may not be able to get them out faster than the fire's going.
And they happen differently than you would expect too, because again, in the Spanish Hills neighborhood, it took that moment of the fire overtaking us. I was very fortunate with the crew I had that we very quickly knew we had to change tactics, and as we were driving through flames, stated, all right, we have to focus on life safety. And there were so many people in the neighborhood that I was unbelievably uncomfortable, and so we just teamed up with the one other sheriff's officer in there and just started yelling at people to leave, because I was concerned that the speed at which it overcame us, being firefighters and thinking we knew fire behavior, like it was going to catch people off guard.
Yeah, and that was one of my fears too. So, obviously our goal was to get out there and get evacuations done door to door as quickly as possible. And we ended up with law enforcement officers from everywhere. I don't even know how many there were there. Hundreds. Yeah. I mean, we were running teams of 10 on the evacuation side, and I got up to the letter QRSTU, like it goes up to U, and still had more law enforcement officers to send out there. And there was a couple things that came out of this. One was, when we're trying to get all those people out, we had almost as many people, for whatever reason, trying to get back in. And then they were causing problems to get, the hoses across the line or driving across it, worried about accidents with the fire trucks and civilians. And then just, they would go to an area thinking it was safe because there was no fire there. And we all, at that point, knew, that could start burning too at any minute. Like, it was not predictable enough. But the other piece to it was the traffic and evacuating. Normally, wildland fire, we're evacuating, maybe 5,000 people, maybe 8,000 people, definitely not 30 or 40,000 people, and trying to get them out of two different cities at the same time. So
I had to use that emotional appeal with a lot of people when they didn't want to leave. I explained to them, I was like, we can't fight the fire if we know you're in your house. We have to focus on life safety, and when you guys are staying here, it changes our ability to work.
Yeah. And so at one point, later in the day, when things started we could catch our breath. I wouldn't say slow down, but we could catch our breath. I had to have a very strong briefing message with the deputies, because even at that point, and law enforcement, I should say, I had to restructure them, because they were, just like everybody else, running into these areas that are on fire, helping people get their stuff. And I'd see the deputies with their eyebrows singed off, and some of them got burns on their backs from the debris flying through the air, cars destroyed. And so at some point, we had to have that harsh conversation with them. We've done the evacuations. You've all gone door to door. They've all been put out where we need to put them out. Now's the time for you guys to slow down, and I needed you guys to start thinking about, if I send you into an area, because we're still dealing with the situational awareness stuff, if I send you to an area that's too dangerous, we've done really dangerous work, and that's what we do. That's what we're supposed to do. Now we can slow it down and don't put yourselves in really bad situations. But I had to take that shift of, here's the immediacy, here's everyone, the life safety priorities, get everybody out. Okay, that's kind of calmed down. Now when we're going back into these areas, you guys and gals need to really be mindful of your own safety on this. So
Yeah, so I had a couple thoughts on what Randy was saying about the evacuations, and the first one was I was really impressed with all of the people and the citizens, like citizens helping citizens. The nature of the fire and the evacuations, I mean, it was so fast that it just, everything happened emergently. And I'll relate the story that, there was so many cars that were clogged up and not moving on McCaslin Hill, when that fire came by. And, I made one loop and the cars were there and the fire crossed, and, in my head I was like, oh man, that's not going to be a good spot. And, the next loop I came back and there was a car on fire. Everybody was gone, but there was just one car still on fire. And I thought, oh, that's not good. And I was able to later find out that, that person's car had basically been choked out by the smoke and became undrivable. And that person jumped out of their car. Somebody let them into their car and they all drove away, and, everybody survived. And, so it was really impressive to see all the people helping each other out. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up that Randy was talking about how the deputies were going in, and, he had to have that talk with them and say, hey, we're going to trust you to go into these areas and make good decisions. And, here's your big picture thing is don't get hurt, right? I kept hearing that on the fire radio channels as well, like, don't get hurt. I know I was relaying similar messages, but the thing that brings up for me is sort of this idea of like decentralized command, right? Like, hey, we don't necessarily have the command infrastructure in place that we would normally have, and so we're gonna trust you to go in and make good decisions, with the guidance of like, hey, life safety and then our safety as well. Big picture guidance of like, hey, do good work where you can do good work. We're going to trust you to make those decisions, but don't get yourself somewhere where you're going to end up stuck and hurt.
Yeah, and for me that worked out well too, because we would assign a group, let's say, to go evacuate a certain area, and typically in the past they would say, command, I've gotten this done. Where's our next assignment? And instead, what they were doing was understanding what the next assignment should be, going and doing that, and then at some point relaying it back to me, so you didn't have that delay in there. So to your point, that decentralized command of, here's the goal, here's what we're trying to get accomplished, go out and do it, we trust you're gonna make good decisions, and they were out there just doing it. And then it didn't help with the situational awareness, because you lose track of somebody out doing one job, but at some point they report back to you, and then you'd understand they did something that you're gonna ask them to do anyway. So I thought it worked out really good that way.
Yeah, and that's not how we normally operate, right? I mean, it's, we, on big fires, typically, we all like to operate in a certain way where, you ask for a resource, the resource gets dispatched to you, they show up in a staging area, they get assigned a leader, they get a job, they go out, they do that job, then they come back, and, it's all very orderly and neat and tidy. And in this case, things were happening so fast and so urgently, and the resources were so short, we just couldn't get the resources we needed fast enough. There was a lot of like trusting people that were working for you to make good decisions and do the job without your direct oversight or you putting even in somebody to oversee them, right? And as the fire went on and we got more resources, we added in those layers, but at the beginning it was just so much more chaotic, and you really had to trust that your folks were gonna go do a great job and not get themselves into too bad of a position that they couldn't get out of.
You talk about people helping people and trust too, like we saw it at the citizens level too, because we had several people in Spanish Hills neighborhood that were elderly, and when we banged on their door, let us know that they couldn't drive, and we were stopping cars that were evacuating and loading up pets and people into cars with, they didn't know each other, and heading out of the neighborhood.
Yeah. And yeah, I think, I mean, your story earlier, not to get away from the citizens or anything, but your story of how you got to the fire, right? You pulled up and you thought, I don't even know if command even knows I'm here. I don't even know if they know this neighborhood's on fire. Yeah. But you knew you had to go to work, and you just did, right? Like that is the decentralized command, type model that we were using, And then obviously later on you got a division supervisor in that area and all that stuff. But yeah, it was literally just you pulling up and being like, okay, like we're gonna try to make a stand here. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because a lot of the conversation discussion, post-incident has been, well, what went wrong, what could have gone better, and we all gravitates back towards what was comfortable, like centralized command, and reliable communications and stuff. But it does make you wonder if we need to change our models a little bit to be more adaptive because of the successes we did see without the dependency on such formal and rigid structures.
Yeah, that was a big learning point for me was, and Annalisa spoke to it when she did the facilitated learning analysis, was how much we had to lead up. And I wish, in retrospect, wish I had done more of it, but it was just, you were so overworked that you were just working, and I could have done more to develop that command structure to communicate out to command.
Annalisa was one of the first resources that Sterling gave up to me, her and her crew, and it really was, right, that initial briefing, and then she went to work and she self-directed. And I think Randy can probably speak to law enforcement mindset where, officers are often independent and more self-initiated than often fire crews are because we work in crews. And so, the shift in gears for a fire company to start what we dangerously label freelancing is uncomfortable for us. Yeah. And that's everyday work for a law enforcement agent. So.
Yep.
Yeah, that concept that the sheriffs, the police and law enforcement use of, find work. Yeah. Just go find work.
You don't tell fire crews to go find work.
Yeah, it's
Because
not
then
often.
then they do.
Yeah.
But it might not be the work you want them to do.
Right. Yeah, we're much more structured, but on that day, there wasn't the infrastructure in place to manage like that. At least not at the beginning.
Yeah, and for me, that was, along this conversation, the whole goal, once I was established, wasn't to, start to be over-directed with the law enforcement. It was to get the situational awareness, and then to start implementing and getting rid of whatever structure we had to a more formal ICS structure, instant command structure, at some point. Just at that initial stages, it just didn't seem like that was ever going to happen. I don't think you could have put that strict structure over that incident at that time. So,
No, that wasn't until, and I lost a lot of sense of time, right? And how fast the day was going, and you would talk to crews and you realize that they'd been out for 8 hours, but from the onset, which was around 11 o'clock, it wasn't until 8 o'clock that the winds really began to subside. And by then, command structure had started to fall in place, but there was no certainty in anybody's mind that the wind was going to stop, right? And that it was going to not stop progressing all the way, to...
Or homes were going to continue to catch on fire. I mean, we were putting out houses on fire at 8 o'clock the next morning.
Well, I mean, at 10 o'clock that night, I mean, I was, I'd been asked to go scout out the fire to see how bad it was, to see if we could stop the evacuation of Good Samaritan Hospital. And, I drove up on the hill and I was like, yeah, I think it's looking pretty good. I think we can probably hold off. And as I'm driving back over the McCaslin Bridge, we get a call that, hey, the roof of Chuck E. Cheese is on fire, and it's like 10:30 at night. And it's like, okay, now we have to manage a commercial structure fire with no water. Things just kept catching on fire, even though the winds had died down, Probably there was a big ember up there that had, been smoldering along all night long.
We found a lot of that in our neighborhood where, you had embers that had gotten seeded in cracks and hidden places. But because it continued to be fed by steady breeze, it just smoldered and smoldered until it got a good foothold. And you talk about, I had crews saying, hey, did you know? And what do you think? And it very much was, we had crews just patrolling for embercast, looking for small starts that were going to take off.
Yeah, I kept thinking I was going to get a break, and it just never happened. Like just one thing after another, until probably midnight when the winds really did kind of finally lay down, and that storm front started moving in a little bit more. But yeah, it was just you think you're going to get a break and something else happens. It was kind of happened with the water supply, right? I mean, you finally think you're starting to make progress, and all of a sudden there's hey, by the way,
I can't tell you how
the water supply is not going to be there in 5 minutes, and. It was like, oh, really?
I can't tell you how defeating that was for the crews that were working. The amount of hard work that had gone on all day, and then to lose the one resource that we had to keep doing it. Yeah.
And I mean, the water utility guys, I mean, they moved mountains to support us. We used all of the water in the Superior area. We used the whole system, and I think Louisville too. We used all the water in the system. To the point where they actually, dumped an entire lake. They opened up the lake and were dumping raw water into the water system to support the firefighting efforts. And then at some point, just enough structures burned down that there's enough holes in the system, so to speak, that we lose water pressure. And yeah, it was truly heartbreaking to finally get to a point where the winds were dying down and to be able to make a stand and feel like you're finally making progress, and then all of a sudden to get the call like, hey, there's no more water. And and then you have to make another mental shift of like, okay, now I have to bring water in for firefighting. Like I was talking about Chuck E. Cheese, and it was, I was using twice the amount of resources to, do sort of a nurse operation, right? We were feeding one engine into another and, using that for the water resource. And it was just, it just made everything 10 times harder.
Yeah, that was a really hard thing for me. I was in what we call our tactical water tender. It has 2,000 gallons. And when I heard the hydrants were lost, I desperately wanted to connect with you guys and figure out how to get that as a resource available down there, because I knew you guys were dealing with bigger structures that were on fire. We were starting to stabilize in Spanish Hills a little bit because of the weather change and the wind shifts. And it was really hard for me to have to go through so many layers of command to try to reach you. And I don't think that my attempts to make known our capability and availability ever got to the right people.
Well, and that main thoroughfare, north to south, was still largely cut off through late in the evening after the water loss event, with large events still going on in between too. So yeah, we were resigned at a certain point.
Well, I think it's important to capture too, along with what you were talking about earlier, and that is, we were nonstop. It was just like go, 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 literally, one fire to the next fire, to the next fire, to the next fire, to the next fire, trying to get ahead of this thing. And I don't think anybody had a break to get a lunch or dinner. Like, it was nonstop until late into the evening. And that wore on people pretty badly.
I got my cruise dinner.
Yeah. I mean, at some point we got some food out, but it was wearing on them. And then, the citizens that were trying to get back in and causing problems with the fire trucks and causing problems with some of that stuff. It's not that I blame them. It's just when they come back in, like we were talking earlier, then we have to shift priorities and we got to watch out for them, and we can't do some of the things we're doing. And the frustrations and those kinds of things, and it took the toll on the deputies as well. They'd take the time to risk their well-being to go into an area to go evacuate all these people, and then they're driving back through a little bit later, and that whole subdivision is gone. So it was a lot.
Another good point that was brought up was, the utilities that responded with us as well. It wasn't just emergency responders. The water departments and the power and gas were amazing to me. It's not that often that you request to turn the natural gas off to an entire town. And we made that request, that there were so many homes burning down and there was so many gas lines left open that you were getting these, you're starting to get these fire fountains out across the town. And so we had to make the call to turn the gas off to the entire town. And that impacts a lot of things that maybe I wasn't quite thinking about when I said that, but it impacted a lot of things. But the utility workers went right to work. They were taking care of down power lines right away to try to save them for us to get through. They found a way to turn the gas off to a town, even though they hadn't ever really done that in that area before. The water department found a way to get water back into the hydrant system when they're out. So there was a huge effort across the board from everybody on this, which was pretty amazing.
The water guys, the Superior water guys, right? Like, they were going to stay, right? And it really was like, it gets to here, you need to go.
Yeah.
And, but they were so committed to holding their post.
Yeah, I think I sent you up there, Aaron, didn't I? I was at one point, I was like, can you go check on we're going to need that water plant. And I think you went up there and checked on it, and yeah, it was, because the water plant was right on the west side, right by the ridge, and it was heavily impacted.
Yeah. So when you see the this is nonstop and it's high risk and it's emotional for everybody. At some point that's when you slow it down and you start having those conversations of, we're in the slower part. We started to slow down. Now's the time to rehydrate, get ready to go again. Coalesce, figure out what's going on. But be ready when this thing, because I fully expected it to start off again later in the night. I expected the winds to pick back up and for us to be right back at ground zero at some point that night. So, you got to get the people to rest and rehabbed when you can, and that's what you can do at that point. But until then, you're just doing work.
On the fire side, it's one of those things where, a lesson learned for me is I'm one of those people that you just keep working and work through it. And it was important to make sure people had water and food and they could get warm for a little bit, because of course, as it always happens in December, in this area, we get this big push of fire, whether it be in the mountains or here, and then for sure it's gonna freeze and snow in the next couple days, which brought a whole host of other issues that came up with it, right? Freezing water pipes because someone asked for the gas to be turned off, and now we don't have furnaces heating homes that weren't burnt. And so now we're gonna have every house with broken water pipes, and what do we do about this? And all these things that started kind of cascading out of it. But as far as the people impact of it, for me personally, I didn't recognize that until several days later, right? And it's still happening, obviously, right? Is the impact it took that people had worked in that area for 20 years, 15 years, even 5 years, and now they see the place is decimated and it's no longer recognizable. And for me, it took a while for that to kind of kick in and say, that's going to impact people for a while to come. And for the mental health side of the house, it's getting better for, at least in the fire department. We're starting to build mental health awareness more and more. It's becoming to the forefront of issues for us. But this was a good driver of that a lot, was to kind of sit back and then see the different crews and how it impacted them. And I think a big part of it is let them tell their story. Let them talk about it. And it's a little bit of rehabilitation. If they can get their story out there a little bit and learn about what other people did, that'll be a great thing from this series, is just kind of learning people's stories, I think. So.
Well, and for me, because again, we're busy, we're doing work. It's like a lot of other high stress, high risk situations. You're not thinking about these things until a day or two later. But I'm sure you guys are in the same boat we were, in that the deputies that work those areas, the deputies that work Superior, they know these people, they get to know them really well, right? And so that's impactful. But then we also had deputies and law enforcement officers whose houses were in these areas and lost houses during this fire. And they're out there, helping their neighbors evacuate, not being able to go take care of their own house and stuff. So when you're in it and you're just going as fast as you can to get as many people to safety as you can, you don't think about it. It's the day or two down the road that's when that starts to sink in and really starts to have an impact on them. So you just gotta watch it and give them resources that they need to work through some of that stuff and let them tell their stories.
Yeah, it just kind of never stops, right? You just never stop thinking about, like, oh, I should have done that. I could have done this differently.
You spend careers like that in this line of work, where you remember your calls, and now you travel through, the communities of Louisville and Superior, like, you're clearly reminded.
Yeah, I talked about leading up and what we had done differently. And for me, a big impact physically, emotionally, everything was going right onto shift the next morning. Again, the duty to uphold and be there and keep working. And Annalisa as well did the same thing. And by the end of the second night, dealing with sprinklers in houses continuing to catch on fire. I remember I got on the phone with Boulder County Dispatch, and I was just so exhausted and tired, and I got angry, and I was just like, why are you continuing to send us into the fire perimeter? We have units here, we have an incident management team here, like, leave me alone, I'm done. Like, I just needed to tap out, and I had no way to do that effectively. And it was hard. I reflect back on it, and I am upset at one point when I got frustrated with dispatch, but Annalisa as well, Chief Flag, I got very short, and I just didn't know how to navigate that better because I was so cooked.
Yeah, it was physically demanding. I mean, people were so sore and so stiff and just beat up. I mean, stuff in your eyes, like, I mean, just, it didn't come out for a couple days, but yeah, you start to, 2 days in and you still haven't got a good night's sleep, and you're just like, holy cow, like.
And then waiting for that next shoe to drop, because you're like, it's not out. This could kick off again. Get ready to have to do this all over again in the next 6 hours.
Yeah. And so that experience, and that's an insight for me, is planning ahead of, not only do you have this major incident going on at the Marshall Fire, but we also have another, 180, 200 square miles that people are still calling 911 in, and we have to deal with that. And then the days after of getting crews rest and relaxation, but still being able to manage 911 calls, and how do we effectively do that? It's a very difficult, tricky thing to kind of navigate, especially, from something this size. Typically we will deal with a structure fire that has 3-4 engines, maybe 5 on it, and it goes for several hours, but this was, thousands of homes. We had every fire truck plus that out of Mountain View's area. And we just drained the tank, and there wasn't much left in reserve to do it. Everybody did an outstanding job of stepping up and, honoring the duty and being there for the citizens. But I would not be surprised if it took years off of people's careers.
Yeah. I think a few other things we should talk about are communications and, radio channels and some of the other effects that you don't normally think of, like turning the power off and now all of a sudden none of the gas stations work. And honestly, you're out there for so long, the fire trucks are all running out of gas, and you're just like, where do we send these guys? And now they're driving 30, 40 minutes down the road to get fuel, and now you've lost your resource for 40 minutes while they go refuel. So
Well, it was a little bit of the expansion, right? Like, you know, I ended up securing dinner for my crews, but I had to drive to Broomfield to get it, you know. And, you know, and it really was chasing the resource. And so those are some of those valuable lessons learned about, well, you know, for every cause there is a reaction, and but the implications. And so, you know, same, you know, with our engines that ended up beginning to run out of fuel because they had been running all day into the night. But those turnaround times created lags as well. And so that was a valuable resource that we needed to keep the fight going. But now the delay to get them back, to get them in the first place was great. To get them back.
Yeah, like you don't normally send a ladder truck on a wildland fire, right? But in this case, you know, where you were, you needed a ladder truck, but there wasn't that many of them, and now all of a sudden you're taking that resource out because they're almost out of gas, you know. And we were, you know, we had gas trucks, we were trying to get them in there, but you know, you just couldn't do it, like in some instances. And so then you're sending them out to go get gas, and now you've lost that resource for 40 minutes to an hour. And
Well, and I think one of the probably why we were so impacted by it as well was that ownership, because it was our district, right?
Right.
And we saw it that next morning where a lot of resources that came in from out of our district were like, all right, we hit our 16, we're going home. And we were just like, we don't have gas or electricity to our fire station. We don't have fuel in our truck. We don't have, I've been awake for 26 hours, right? Like when we wanted somebody to help step in, and the system just wasn't built for us to know how to be okay and to transition that.
Let others
Yeah.
do our jobs.
Yeah, let others do our jobs. And yeah, that was hard. It was very impactful on me because you know, I wanted somebody to step in and help and alleviate me. And there just was nobody there because the houses across the street are on fire.
yeah, so one of the things that you know we've talked about internally is sort of like managing those gap areas, right? So there's the initial gap of the initial attack where you know the incident command isn't supported by emergency management yet. You know, there's a spin up time for the OEM to get set up, but then there's also that other gap of, you know, when the fires kind of died down a little bit and before the big incident management team that's been ordered, before the type 1 team takes over, right? And we're still running, you know, 911 calls and running inside the fire perimeter, and, you know, and it just sort of takes that toll. And so I think, you know, we've internally talked about it, you know, but how do we manage those different gap areas, and what sort of, you know, resources do we need to build as an agency to, you know, better manage those time windows?
Yeah, and along those lines, for us on the law side, you know, every law enforcement officer in the sheriff's office and our surrounding agencies were engaged in the incident. And so we had to send somebody to dispatch to start triaging some of those calls and hold some of those resources out to go respond to, you know, law enforcement calls of 911. Because you do have that time frame where you're having to do both, and you can't just focus in on the large incident. You still have to you know, provide service to the rest of the citizens of Boulder County who, you know, are still calling for cars being stolen and those kinds of things. So it's how do you manage that gap time?
Yeah, I never really thought about this before, but I'm sure for law enforcement, it's actually probably even a bigger problem, because not only do you have to manage the reentry and all the checkpoints that you've established, but now you have to, you know, deal with any looting issues or any sort of those issues, and then on top of that, all the regular 911 calls, and yeah, that's a massive policing effort.
Yes, it is.
Sure.
Gets me that way.
That reentry of residents or suspected residents into our area. Our fire crews were encountering people we weren't sure were supposed to be there.
Yeah.
And it was really uncomfortable for them to be confronting individuals that they weren't sure were there for the right reasons.
Yeah, and for us on the law enforcement side, that again, wildland fires, we can evacuate an area, we can hold it with checkpoints and keep people out. This one, there was no keeping people out. It was
bike paths.
Yeah, they would park down in Broomfield and walk over, bike paths. And so, yeah, that reentry and keeping people out of those areas we didn't want people into just yet was really difficult.
Yeah, and you know, we ran in, you know, and I've heard since then, you know, talked to a number of homeowners and stuff, but, you know, a lot of people evacuated, but didn't necessarily think it was such a big deal, right? They thought, oh yeah, it's, you know, wildland fire, like you gotta be kidding me, I'll be back in like an hour. They left their pets and their, clothes. Like a lot of them left without shoes, and and all of a sudden now they're, they have. It's winter. The next day it snowed like 1.5 feet, and they've got no shoes, no clothes. Their cats are home. There's no gas. There's no heat. It created a major issue, and so people wanted to get back in, and I'm sure from the law enforcement side, and I know from the fire side it was challenging, but doubly challenging for you.
Yeah, and to your point too, about the utilities, having those people on site, having the representatives on site to make some of those decisions, turning off the gas or turning on the gas or shutting electricity off here or re-energizing certain lines, and having that ability to go direct with somebody on site during the incident was huge. I thought it was huge.
Yeah, the utility people are impressive. I mean, when you drive down Marshall Road and every single telephone or power pole is burnt down, and the wires are just laying on the ground.
And they're back up in the next 3 days?
Yeah, and then within 3 days they have the whole thing back up. It was impressive.
Yeah, so one issue too, and it's kind of touched on a couple times, and PJ brought it up, is that communications. There was just so many people on this incident, both fire and law, that communications became somewhat difficult. Overall, I will say on the law side, the communications went fairly well. But what we had, and I'm sure you guys ran into the same issue, was agencies coming from all across the Front Range with all various types of radios, and getting everybody to be able to communicate on the same single radio channel was impossible. It just wasn't going to happen. So for us, we ended up bringing in caches of radios to hand out to the law enforcement officers, so that they could communicate back to the command post and get assignments and all things. But how did you guys end up dealing with some of that?
Part of it was, and we've talked about this a little bit, is just the scaling of the incident so quickly was hard to get. On the fire side, it was harder for us to get our communications plans in place. But once they were in place, same thing. People coming from all over, didn't have the radio channel, couldn't find the radio channel, something like that. How we dealt with it was we tried to put people that were on like radios in one area and people that were on like other radios in another area. A lot of cell phone usage was used. Like we defaulted to a lot of cell phone coverage. That was a majority of my conversation, I think. It was difficult for sure, and in theory we have a plan worked out where we all have these mutual aid channels and stuff, but there just wasn't enough of it to be able to make it happen in this case. So
yeah, I remember I called PJ at like midnight because I had heard there was like the start of an IAP, and I didn't know.
What's an IAP?
An incident action plan that details the communications, the geographic assignments, the resources on scene. It gives you a picture of what's going on, what the plan is. And I had heard that there was the start of one, and I just really wanted that situational awareness to know where the people that I lean heavily on were at, and because I felt alone in Spanish Hill still. And PJ just had to, that was the only way I could connect with anybody that I knew was in the mix, and you just sent me a photo of it, right?
Yeah.
And so it was like handing out candy to all the other engines that were in our division of like, oh yeah, so look, this is where they're at, this is what's going on here, and people just wanted that information.
Yeah.
Because it just was so
Uncomfortable without
distant.
it.
Yeah, uncomfortable without it. Yeah.
Yep. People have asked me like, what do you think about the incident? It was like, well, pretty much everything I did that night was uncomfortable. Like I don't think I did anything that felt comfortable. It was just, whether it was putting people into a decentralized command situation or not having the resources you needed or anything, and just knowing that you're sending folks out into a pretty dire situation. Everything felt uncomfortable. You get a phone call and you're like, hey, we need to evacuate an entire hospital. It's like, geez, okay. But I will say one of the wins that happened in my division that was sort of an unintentional win on my part, but just more of who I placed into the position was using an unaffected dispatch center. So I had placed Chief Doherty with North Metro Fire in charge of the Avista evacuation, and because of the proximity, he was also ended up managing that St. Andrews neighborhood to the north. And he was able to order through his own dispatch center, which freed up a lot of the radio traffic on my division. But he was also getting resources that maybe we wouldn't have gotten through incident command, and requesting them, in they were showing up, and they were all, it's because they're used to operating together. You had North Metro, Westminster, Thornton, all operating on like channels, and so it made it much easier for that section of the fire. So that is for sure a win that I would say is, use an unaffected dispatch center. And if you're, ordering outside of the normal incident command, try to use that as much as possible.
Well, that was a kind of a learning point for me too with communications, and maybe for better or worse, I knew that was happening. Like I could tell anytime I tried to connect with dispatch or reach out to command, there was just so much other communications that at some point I was just like, we're just gonna work, and I'm not even gonna burden it. Like, there's more good to be done by me working than to talk to somebody right now.
Yeah, and I've heard that from a number of firefighters. Like, it was, they just, at some point it was, the radio communications were so hectic, it was just, just go to work.
Yeah, and face to face, right? Like, we got task force sent up that was largely comprised of El Paso units out of Colorado Springs and Pueblo, and of course, radio issues. Fortunately, we were in a fairly consolidated area and neighborhood, but it was all face to face and a lot of running around. It was a lot of footwork,
Yeah, if you get put in charge of that area, I mean, the majority of what I did was drive around that night, like from place to place, whether it was, figuring out where I'm going to put the next resources, or talking to one of the group supervisors that I had, or, it was just, there was so much of that.
Yeah. If I needed to talk to Sterling, I drove down to see him. Tell him his hospital or his hotel was on fire.
Right. I mean, it was chaotic in my car. I think I had 4 radios and my cell phone working in the car, and
So as we wrap this up, what are 1 or 2 insights that you would like to share with others that you learned from this?
I think it's hard to keep it to 2, but I'm still learning things from this incident. It's every time I think about it, every time I have to talk about it, I come up with other things. But one would be resource management. I mean, the way resources get managed and ordered, and there's, at least in the fire service, we try to have a pretty defined way to do that, and it was challenging, and it wasn't enough. So you just couldn't get the resources you needed when you needed them. So figuring out how and where to use them, but more importantly, how to order them. And so going outside of ways that you're maybe comfortable with ordering them, finding alternate pathways to get resources ordered, especially in that really hectic initial attack phase. That would probably be one of my biggest ones, is just no different ways to order resources, and I know I've talked about it, but use those unaffected dispatch centers. I ordered ambulances through the Healthcare Coalition and emergency management. It was just, there was all sorts of different ways that resources got to us outside of what I would call, sort of the normal chain of command of incident command. And it helped us solve a lot of problems. So that would for sure be one. Another one is the communications. I would say pick more radio channels than you think you need initially. Like, I ended up setting up my division on Red Northwest, which is a patched channel, and it's known across the region. Most everybody has it, which was a good choice, but it wasn't enough. I should have had quite a few more channels. But once you kind of get that set up initially, you're sort of stuck with it. And we organically, used North Metro's dispatch and some of their channels, which helped, but there just still wasn't enough radio channels in my division, and so the main channel was oftentimes clogged up. So, if you find yourself in that position, pick more channels that you can use later.
I think it depends a little bit on who we're answering that question to. If it's my peers, it would be imagine the possibilities. It took me a long time to imagine the possibilities of what was happening and where it was going. And I think all of us talked about that situational awareness and the difficulty. If we're talking about the communities that we serve, it's imagine the possibilities and be prepared, because this is not the last big fire.
Yeah, one of the things that sticks with me is kind of a quote, and that speaks well to what I think I learned, and it's, no one is coming, it's up to us. And that's kind of what I feel like I learned, particularly with as close to home as this was. And I think how badly I wanted to have a support system, realizing that we were the tip of the spear for having to affect this, and that leading up and having to make big decisions, right? And big actions, and it's going to have a big impact, and you just have to own it.
And that you were ready for it. Just got to believe you're ready for it.
Yeah, for me, I think one of the things that we didn't really touch on, but it was a really big lesson learned that I thought went really well for the law enforcement side was, you know, before I could get down there, there were other sergeants from the sheriff's office who were tying directly in with the firefighters. And I just look at that and see how poorly that would have went had that not happened as fast as it did. And then we maintained that connection between law enforcement and fire so that fire could go fight fires and law enforcement could, you know, deal with the traffic and the people and the evacuations. And I've seen that not work out well on other incidents where you have, you know, firefighters making evacuations and then law enforcement doing evacuations and they don't know what they're doing. And so it's just imperative that that tie-in between fire and law happen really fast, really quickly, and it remains there the whole incident. So that was one for me. The other one kind of goes back to what you're saying in the community and even law enforcement. That is, you know, it seems like when we were evacuating people, those numbers of people, one of the things we have not encountered until Marshall were those large amount of numbers of people trying to evacuate, and for whatever reason, a large amount of numbers trying to come back into the area and causing the traffic issues that they were causing. I think we all could in our minds see that that was going to happen, but until you experience it, it's hard to understand it, I guess. So for me, it was, you know, make sure that we can start to, identify certain areas that we're going to have to control pretty quickly and get law enforcement there to shut those places off so people evacuate. The other thing that was kind of interesting was some of those traffic jams were caused because people were trying to follow the rules of the road and causing backups, right? And so sometimes it's not just the volume, it's also make sure that there's somebody there to tell somebody, hey,
Run the red light.
go, like, you know, the fire's coming from the west, go east and get out of town. So, so those are two big lessons I took away from it.
Yeah, I think that unified command piece is huge, right? I mean, we talk about that in other incident types, but like, you know, it really needs to be unified in a hip-to-hip fashion. Like, you know, especially, you know, with the wind and everything like that, like those officers and the fire response, they need to be literally physically either in the same car or very close together to manage that.
Yep.
For me, it all comes down to relationships, both for the public and for, you know, the responders. Is we talked about neighbors helping neighbors, and that doesn't happen unless you have the relationships within your neighborhood. And you can't wait till the day of to build these relationships. And we talked about operating in the chaos and being comfortable in the chaos and trusting each other on the responder side, and that doesn't happen in the moment. That happens by the relationships that you build ahead of time. And so for me, it's build the relationships, promote relationships within your community, and promote relationships within your department and with neighboring departments, or even the next door to the neighboring departments. Text groups on your block, and you can do this if you just at home. Like, all of us in the room can walk away and say, you know what, I'm going to text my 4 neighbors and just get my information, and I'm going to check on them, and you know, I'll watch your trash cans when I'll put them away when they come in, or if you're going out of town, let me know. I'd be happy to watch your house for you. Just keep an eye on it. And same thing for the responders is take a moment to learn the station of the department next to you and what do they do, and meet up with them every now and then. That way, when it's not the first time we've seen each other, and there's builds a lot more trust. So for me, it came down to relationships and get out and build relationships.
Well, and something that I know you've talked about before, but, you know, like even thinking outside of our normal response groups, but, you know, like adding in utilities to your everyday response, right? I mean, if there's a wind event, you know, like, how many times do we spend, you know, on a gas leak sitting around waiting for XL or whoever the energy group is to show up? Like, you know, create those relationships and get them on your everyday responses, because, you know, that might help down the road, because we sure needed those folks on the day of. And yeah, if you can build those relationships, do it.
Now, I've got a good kind of a little side story of speaking to your law enforcement and fire working next to each other. Was one of the incidents in Spanish Hills was we were doing the evacuation, and we came across somebody who owned a barn full of horses. And we told them they had to evacuate, and they said, we have to just set our horses free. And so we jumped out of the engine to help them. And it was this very surreal, like dream-like state where embers and smoke are just saturating you, and we're opening these pins and horses are just running by, and it felt very apocalyptic. And then I had a little, what are the small ponies?
Like a miniature horse?
Yeah, a miniature horse that wouldn't leave, and it just like stayed next to my side and like kept following me. But that was in the heat of the moment, and about 45 minutes later, the same homeowner showed up with law enforcement and a trailer because these horses were just running around the neighborhood. And I just looked at the sheriff's officer and I said, "Are we doing this?" And he said, "Yep." So we went in and corralled all these horses and loaded them up, and it was just, at the moment, it was a small win, and felt good when things didn't feel good.
Yeah. Yeah. Like Chief Fulton touched on earlier, I mean, we've thought about this and planned for this scenario, and always knew that wildland fire was a possibility. And we go out nationally and fight, help fight big fires all over the place. But I think that for me, what made this fire, sort of something that, maybe you imagined on some level, but was a little bit, to Aaron's point, beyond the imaginable, was the speed and just how fast it came, and the amount of damage that it did so quickly. I mean, in the last 2 years, I've had to change how I think about wildland fires. Right? I mean, we had the Troublesome Fire, which I always thought the Continental Divide was a pretty good fire break, right? And the Troublesome Fire went over that like it wasn't even there, and and then we get a grass fire in the Marshall area that jumps Highway 36, and like you said, I mean, there's literally flames shooting across this 7 or 8 lane freeway, and you just like, what? Like, that is almost unbelievable, but now it is believable. So my advice would be to really try to sort of imagine the unimaginable, and take what you think is possible and plan for it, or take what you think is impossible and plan for it, right? And prepare for it, right?
We have a diverse community and an expansive community, an area of service, and a lot of urban interface, which you see on that national level as we've traveled to California and whatnot. But now, when I drive through our communities and our areas of service, I see the Marshall Fire, and I see the potentials and the possibilities of the Marshall Fire that I couldn't before because I hadn't seen it. But it's all around us now.
Yeah, well, and it makes me think, as I drive through them, like, now I drive through a community, and all I can think of is, what am I missing, right? Like, what haven't I imagined, right? And just what do I need to plan for?
Yeah. For me, like I've said, I've been on a bunch of big fires, Troublesome, Calwood, Left Hand, a bunch of them. Tons of them. And for me, when I hear wind and I know there's fire, and I get in that mindset, I understand that up there. I understand that in those areas. This, for whatever reason, took me a little bit by surprise because I didn't expect this type of fire to be down here in this area, if that makes sense. It wasn't that it wasn't possible or wasn't on my radar. It just didn't register correctly in my brain. The Middle Fork fire that I was on, I fully expected that to run clear out into the middle of Boulder County somewhere. Like, that fire in my brain, I understood it was going to go that route, or could go that route, let's say. This one, for whatever reason, it took me a little time to catch up to speed to say, holy cow, where are we going to stop this? Is it going to stop where we have it? Is it going to go into Lafayette and Erie? Where does this stop? So to me, that's that piece that you're talking about is, I just have to reframe my thought process and put this in the category of possibilities and be better prepared for it.
One of the lessons learned that, since you asked that question, Roy, that I just remembered was, I talked about the amount of time it takes to get a resource. Well, where I learned is, order for what you think order for what you're not really thinking about, right? So, in the story, that I would relay is, I would order a Type 6 engine, which is typically a wildland engine. It's more of a pickup truck with a tank and water on it, right? It can go 4-wheel drive, because you had fire in the grass and you had fire in the wildland area. But by the time that that resource actually showed up, it had gotten into the neighborhoods, right? And now I didn't need a Type 6 engine. I needed a strike team of structure engines, So that ability to sort of imagine the impossible and order resources based on that, right? I never thought I'd be on a wildland fire ordering, the amount of structure engines that I was ordering or needing. And I heard a good quote. Somebody made the joke of like, well, what's your fuel type? Fuel type's a big thing in the wildland realm, and it's like, oh, light grasses, and well, now the fuel type is structure. Like, it's consuming so many structures that you need much bigger and more capable resources than what you thought you were going to need when you started ordering 2 hours ago.
Yeah, I didn't think about calling for tenders until we lost water.
Right.
Yeah, when I'm upstairs, when I know there's a reservoir 50 feet above me,
Yeah.
Well,
Yep.
We did good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a lot of good work that day.
Yeah. But you look back and I don't know. I mean, I continually think about what ifs. What if I'd done this different? What if I'd done that different? What if I'd been there at a different time? What if I had gotten? It goes on and on.
Yeah, you talk about the mental health component of it, right? I mean, I think that was one of the big things for the responders as well as, you want to feel good about the work you did, but it's sort of hard to feel good about $1 billion in losses and, neighborhoods that you've spent 20 years protecting and, and your friends' houses are burned down and, you can't feel, you just can't feel good about that. But, there was so much good work that went on that day and, people taking risks and just doing amazing things that, stories that haven't gotten out there yet or anything like that. So
Yeah.
it was impressive to see, the effort and the amount of work that went into controlling that fire.
Yeah.
Well, I think that wraps us up. Does everybody feel good? Have anything else they want to talk about?
Sounds great.
No,
It's all good.
thanks everybody for being here.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for watching. We appreciate your time, and go out there and be safe.